Two arrogant cops mocked a black man in court, laughing, smirking, thinking he was just another defendant. What they didn't know: he was the director of the FBI, and one move turned their world upside down. The laughter of uniformed cops echoed through the courtroom like a cruel soundtrack. They weren't laughing at a joke, or a mistake, or even the judge's comment. They were laughing at him. David Cole stood alone at the defense table, his dark suit sharp against the polished wood, his posture calm yet commanding. But to the officers in blue, he was just another black man on trial, someone they could mock without consequence. "Man, look at him," Officer Rick Thompson snickered, not bothering to lower his voice. "All dressed up like he's somebody. What's he going to do, charm the jury?" His partner, Officer Brad Miller, smirked wider. "Bet he's never even stepped foot in a courtroom unless it was in trouble. This'll be quick." The laughter spread, low and poisonous, rolling across the rows of officers. Their badges gleamed under the lights, but their behavior made the courtroom feel less like a place of justice and more like a circus. But David didn't move, didn't blink. He let them laugh, let them think he was powerless. The truth sat heavy on his shoulders like armor. If they knew who he really was, their laughter would die in their throats. Even Judge Evelyn Harris raised an eyebrow, unsettled by the smugness of the cops and the unnerving calm of the man they mocked. Something about him didn't fit the picture of a desperate defendant. David straightened his tie slowly, his face unreadable. If they thought this was a trial, they were wrong. This was a lesson, and it hadn't even begun. The trial began with the usual rituals, the gavel striking, the judge calling the court to order, the prosecutor rising with rehearsed confidence. But beneath the surface of procedure, the disrespect in the room was loud, unashamed, and directed entirely at David Cole. Mark Reynolds, the prosecutor, adjusted his tie and smiled thinly at the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today we're here to hold this man accountable. A man who, despite appearances, believes he can act above the law." His words dripped with manufactured seriousness, but his eyes gleamed with arrogance. Behind him, the row of officers shifted, exchanging smirks. Officer Rick Thompson leaned toward Brad Miller, his voice carrying just enough for others to hear. "Above the law?" "More like above his pay grade," he sneered. Brad stifled a laugh, his shoulders shaking. David's attorney, Laura Bennett, glanced at him nervously. She whispered, "David, they're trying to bait you. Don't react." But David didn't need the reminder. His expression remained unshaken, his silence deeper than the courtroom's polished floors. He could have silenced the entire room with a single sentence, a sentence that revealed his true position, but not yet. Timing was everything. Reynolds paced dramatically, playing to the jury. "This man disrespected our officers. He resisted. He mocked the badge that protects us all. If we allow him to walk free, what message does that send?" The jury shifted uneasily, caught between the confidence of the prosecutor and the quiet, commanding presence of the accused. At the officers' table, Rick snorted. "Protects us all? Except him, apparently." More laughter followed, casual, cruel, and unchecked. David finally lifted his gaze, his eyes locking on the laughing men. For a flicker of a second, Rick's smile faltered. There was something in that look, something dangerous, something powerful. They thought this was their stage. They had no idea they were performing in his courtroom. The courtroom air grew heavier as Prosecutor Mark Reynolds strutted across the floor like he owned it. His voice boomed with false conviction, carefully chosen words aimed to sway the jury. "Law and order means nothing if men like him think they can trample over it," Reynolds declared, pointing toward David with theatrical emphasis. "The officers here risk their lives daily. And what does this man do? He spits on their sacrifice." Rick Thompson leaned back in his chair, smirking. "That's right. Preach it, Mark," he muttered, loud enough to stir chuckles among the officers again. Brad Miller folded his arms, grinning smugly, as though the trial was already won. But not everyone was laughing. Judge Evelyn Harris noticed the undercurrent of mockery and frowned slightly. Though she hadn't pieced it together yet, she sensed an imbalance. Trials weren't meant to feel like comedy shows, yet these officers acted as if the outcome was guaranteed. David Cole's stillness became more noticeable. He didn't fidget, didn't squirm, didn't show an ounce of fear. His composure, steady as stone, contrasted sharply with the smug energy of the men across from him. The jury stole glances at him, perhaps expecting an outburst, perhaps waiting for a slip. None came. Laura Bennett shifted in her seat, whispering urgently. David, they're painting you as dangerous, arrogant. We need to counter this image. At least let me challenge their narrative. David turned to her, his voice low and deliberate. Not yet. Let them speak. Every word is a rope, and they're tying the noose themselves. For the first time, a ripple of unease stirred in the room. Brad caught David's gaze and quickly looked away. Rick, ever the louder one, masked his nerves with a laugh, but even his tone cracked faintly. The courtroom hadn't seen a defendant before who looked less like a man on trial, and more like a man in control. The courtroom had been filled with one voice after another, the prosecutor's booming tone, the officers snickering, the restless murmurs of the jury. But the man at the center of it all, David Cole, had remained silent. His silence was its own kind of power, unsettling those who paid attention. Finally, Judge Evelyn Harris adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. Mr. Cole, do you wish to respond to these charges? You've been quiet for quite some time. All eyes turned to him. The room seemed to still, as though waiting for an ordinary plea from an ordinary man. But David's voice, when it came, was nothing of the sort. Steady, deep, commanding. I will respond, David said, his tone slicing through the courtroom chatter like a blade through glass. But before I do, I suggest that those laughing at me remember something important. Appearances can be deceiving. Rick Thompson let out a scoff. Oh, here we go. Another speech. Brad chuckled beside him, shaking his head. But the jury leaned forward, curiosity sparked. David continued, his eyes sweeping over the rows of officers. You wear uniforms, you carry weapons, and you believe those things make you powerful. But real power isn't in the badge. It's in integrity. It's in truth. And truth always comes to light. The words settled over the room like smoke, curling into every corner. A few jurors shifted, the weight of his voice heavier than they expected. Even Judge Harris tilted her head, studying him more carefully now. Rick forced another laugh, but his face betrayed a flicker of unease. Brad glanced at the prosecutor, uncertain. Reynolds stiffened, annoyed that David's calm authority had disrupted his rhythm. David's silence had been a weapon. His words, now, were fire. And this was only the beginning. The prosecutor cleared his throat, eager to steal back the spotlight. Ladies and gentlemen, don't be fooled by smooth words. This man is clever, yes, but cleverness doesn't erase guilt. He gestured to the row of officers, who nodded along, puffing up their chests as if their very presence sealed the truth. Officer Rick Thompson leaned forward, voice dripping with mockery. Integrity? Truth? Save the speeches, buddy. You're sitting on the wrong side of the courtroom for that. His laughter rang out, sharp and ugly, followed by Brad Miller's snort. The ripple of amusement spread again, but this time it was thinner, weaker. The jury didn't laugh. A few even frowned, shifting uncomfortably at the blatant disrespect. Judge Harris's gavel struck the desk once. Bang! Order in the court. This is not a playground, gentlemen. But Rick couldn't stop himself. With all due respect, Your Honor, some men just don't belong in suits, and this one sure doesn't belong here pretending he's innocent. Brad smirked, adding under his breath, Yeah, looks more like he belongs behind bars than in front of the jury. David Cole turned his head slowly, fixing them with a stare so steady it seemed to freeze the air. His lips curved into the faintest smile, not of amusement, but of certainty. He leaned slightly toward his attorney, speaking just loud enough for those nearby to hear. They think I don't belong here. Soon they'll realize I'm the only one who does. Laura Bennett glanced at him, startled by the quiet confidence in his tone. She whispered, David, are you planning something? He didn't answer. His eyes returned to the officers, burning with an authority they didn't yet recognize. For now, he let them laugh. For now, he let them mock. Because the fall is hardest when it comes from a place of arrogance. And their fall was coming. The trial pressed forward, but something had shifted. The jury was no longer entirely locked onto the prosecutor's performance. Their eyes drifted, again and again, toward David Cole. His silence had weight. His words had edge. And now a sense of mystery began to curl around him like smoke. Prosecutor Mark Reynolds tried to reassert dominance. The defendant speaks of truth and integrity, he said, pacing. Yet he stands accused of obstructing officers in the line of duty. He thinks he can outsmart justice, but the facts are plain as day, Rick Thompson muttered with a smirk. He's guilty, Your Honor. End of story. Brad Miller chuckled beside him. Yeah, I bet he'll cry when the cuffs click. This time, though, their arrogance fell flat. Even Judge Harris narrowed her eyes at the open disrespect. Then David finally spoke again, calm, controlled, cutting. "You speak of facts," he said, his voice carrying clearly. "But what you call facts are nothing more than assumptions built on arrogance. You assume I am powerless. You assume I am cornered. But you've made one very dangerous mistake." The courtroom stilled. "And what mistake is that, Mr. Cole?" the judge asked, her tone sharp with curiosity. David's eyes swept the room, resting on the laughing officers. "You've mistaken silence for weakness. You've mistaken dignity for fear. And above all," he leaned forward, his voice dropping, "you've mistaken who I am." A ripple of unease passed through the courtroom. Some of the jurors leaned forward. A reporter scribbled furiously on her notepad. Even Reynolds's confident stride faltered for the first time. Rick tried to laugh it off, but his chuckle rang hollow. "Who you are? You're nobody. Just another criminal trying to act smart." David's gaze never broke. His half-smile carried the weight of a secret that could shatter their confidence in an instant. The officers thought they were mocking a defendant, but the defendant was about to reveal he had the power to judge them all. By mid-afternoon, the trial had devolved into a dangerous game. The prosecutor's arguments grew louder, more desperate, while the officers' arrogance only swelled. Each passing hour emboldened Rick and Brad, as though mocking David Cole was their personal duty. Rick leaned forward, his chair screeching across the floor. "Your Honor, it's obvious this man thinks he's smarter than everyone here. Just look at him. He hasn't even denied the charges. He's just playing word games." Brad smirked. "Yeah, probably rehearsed that little speech in the mirror. Maybe even cried when he practiced." Snickers spread through the officers' row, but this time the sound no longer filled the room with ease. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Judge Harris tapped her gavel once, her patience thinning. "Officers," she said firmly, "I will not tolerate further disruptions. This is a court of law." Rick shrugged. "With all due respect, Judge, some people don't deserve the same courtesy, especially not men like him." He jerked his chin toward David, his voice dripping contempt. The words landed like poison in the air. Even Reynolds froze, realizing the line between prosecution and blatant racism had just been crossed. A few jurors exchanged looks, their expressions hardening, skeptical. David finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he rose to his feet. His tall frame towered, commanding silence without raising his voice. "You find it easy to laugh at me," David said calmly, his voice steady as stone. "But every word you've spoken has exposed more about you than about me." Rick rolled his eyes. "Oh yeah? What's it exposed?" David leaned forward, his gaze sharp enough to cut. "That you are not men of law. You are men drunk on a uniform, and men like that are dangerous." The words carried a chilling weight, silencing even the snickering officers in the back row. For the first time, the power in the room shifted, just slightly but undeniably, toward David. They had crossed a line, and David Cole was about to erase it permanently. The silence in the courtroom was thick, hanging like storm clouds. David Cole stood at the defense table, his calm presence demanding more respect than the gavel itself. The jury watched him closely now, their skepticism shifting into curiosity. Judge Evelyn Harris adjusted her glasses, her tone clipped. "Mr. Cole, this is your chance to clarify matters. If you have something important to say, you may proceed." David's eyes swept the room, pausing on Rick and Brad, who sat rigid in their seats. He allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for discomfort to settle in. Then, with quiet precision, he spoke. "I am not here to defend myself," David said, his voice steady, powerful. "I am here to remind this courtroom, and these officers, what justice truly looks like." A murmur rippled across the gallery. Rick forced a laugh. Here we go again, another speech from Mr. Nobody. But David didn't even glance his way. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket. For a brief moment, the officers tensed, but what he pulled out was not a weapon. It was a sleek black leather wallet. He laid it flat on the defense table, flipping it open with a deliberate motion. The golden badge inside gleamed under the courtroom lights. Gasps erupted. The jury leaned forward. A reporter dropped her pen. Even Judge Harris froze, her eyes widening as she recognized the insignia. David's voice lowered, commanding the entire room. "My name is David Cole, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words slammed into the courtroom like a thunderclap. Rick's smirk collapsed. Brad blinked, his face draining of color. The prosecutor stuttered mid-step, his rehearsed rhythm shattered. David continued, his gaze unblinking. You mocked me because of the color of my skin. You assumed I was powerless. But let me make one thing clear. Your arrogance is not just disrespectful, it's criminal. The courtroom, moments ago filled with laughter, now sat in stunned, breathless silence. The trap had been sprung. For a long, suspended second, no one moved. The FBI badge on the table gleamed like a silent gavel, rewriting the entire meaning of the trial. Then chaos broke. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom, reporters scrambling to jot down every word. One even darted toward the door to call her editor. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed looks, their skepticism replaced by shock and shame. Judge Evelyn Harris's gavel slammed hard. Bang, bang, order, order in the court. But her own eyes betrayed disbelief as she stared at David's credentials. The realization that she had been presiding over a case against the FBI director sent a chill through her spine. At the officers' table, panic bloomed. Rick Thompson shot up from his chair, face flushed. This is some kind of trick. He's lying. His voice cracked, no longer carrying the smug confidence it once did. Brad Miller tugged at his collar, sweat beading on his forehead. That can't be real. He can't. His words stumbled over themselves, collapsing into silence. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm was louder than their panic. You laughed at me, mocked me, reduced me to nothing. Yet while you carried yourselves like kings in a courtroom, you didn't realize you were standing in front of a man who oversees your entire chain of command. The gallery buzzed, phones lifted, as spectators whispered frantically. This was no longer just a trial. It was a scandal unraveling in real time. Reynolds, the prosecutor, paled as he clutched his notes. His rehearsed case evaporated in an instant. He cleared his throat shakily. Your Honor, I request... But Judge Harris cut him off sharply, her voice trembling with restrained fury. Request nothing, Mr. Reynolds. This court will pause until I understand exactly what has been placed before me. David straightened, slipping his badge back into his jacket. His gaze returned to Rick and Brad, who now sat frozen, their arrogance gutted. You wanted a trial? He said coldly. You've just put yourselves on one. The courtroom no longer belonged to the prosecutor, the judge, or even the jury. It belonged entirely to David Cole. The badge had shifted the balance of power, and everyone felt it. Judge Evelyn Harris leaned forward, her stern face tightening. Mr. Cole, Director Cole, why was this information not disclosed earlier? David's voice was calm, measured. Because I wanted to see how far the mockery would go. I wanted to witness firsthand the rot within the very system I swore to protect. And today, in this courtroom, you've shown me exactly what I came to confirm. Rick Thompson's hands trembled on the table. His bravado was gone, replaced by a rising fear he could not mask. This is insane. We didn't know who you were. David's eyes locked on him, unflinching. Exactly. And that's the problem. You didn't care who I was. To you, I was just a black man. That was enough to justify your laughter, your scorn, your disrespect of this court. Brad Miller swallowed hard, his voice faltering. We were just joking. David's tone cut like a blade. You mocked me in front of a jury. You disrespected a court of law. And you revealed your bias so openly that even the walls of this courtroom can no longer ignore it. Jokes have consequences, gentlemen. The gallery erupted with murmurs again, reporters typing furiously. This was no longer just news. It was history unfolding. Prosecutor Reynolds stammered, Director Cole, with all due respect this case. David raised a hand, silencing him instantly. His authority was absolute. The case is no longer about me. It is about them, their conduct, their corruption, and the system that enabled it. Judge Harris, regaining composure, nodded slowly. Then this court will redirect its focus. Her gavel slammed down. Effective immediately, this trial is suspended pending a review of misconduct. Rick and Brad sat pale, sweating, their smirks dead and buried. For the first time, they weren't laughing. For the first time, they understood fear. By the time the trial recessed, the courthouse was no longer just a building of law. It had become the epicenter of a national storm. Outside, cameras flashed in rapid bursts. Reporters clustered on the courthouse steps, microphones raised high, their voices overlapping in chaos. Director Cole, why were you on trial? Was this a setup? What happens to the officers now? David Cole emerged through the courthouse doors flanked by stunned security guards. He didn't rush. Every step was Delib.